This video is sponsored by the evil bioweapon researchers of the survival horror genre. Fellas, if your girl is missing an arm and both of her legs, has a parasite in her body that will kill her in mere hours, and only has access to a bunch of DOS-ass looking computers from 1995, then great news, she can still easily play this game. Now that's what I call introducing accessibility without sacrificing difficulty. I would ask for game journalists to take notes, but I'd be surprised if any of them could resist the urge of dropping the game on the third level because it doesn't have a 2-hour walking simulator at the beginning that acts as a tutorial for 5 buttons and sends 2 enemies at you, so that you can safely make a first 30 minutes of gameplay video without embarrassing yourself like the pigeon brain you are. Never mind. A lot of you may think that I am bashing these types of games, but I don't actually mind when a game is cutscene heavy or handholds for a bit at the beginning as long as it's good. And I know what makes a game good is very subjective and consists of a lot of different aspects, which is precisely why I'm not going to delve into what I mean by that and just going to define it as how well a game does what it's trying to do. I don't want to make half of the video just me discussing general topics about video games, especially when the specific game it revolves around is as niche in its appeal as this one, and you get the point by now anyway. Now that that's out of the way, where I was going with my earlier ramblings on those ambitious cinematic AAA titles with 2-hour interactive tutorial movies is the fear they all instill in me. A fear of commitment and the overwhelming number of things that could go wrong from the very moment you boot up the game to the last time you close it. Yes, I know that these are not the most interesting fears out there, like globophobia, since none of you watching this channel will get into a relationship serious enough to experience the former, but still have some idea of what it is thanks to your growing backlog of animes, and you all probably experienced the latter with pretty much any technological device you ever bought. It's a shame how often that fear becomes a reality too. I have gone through enough wireless earphones to make me stick to my wired ones in the year 2022 and swear an oath that I will never ever accept a sponsorship by Raycon as long as I have the sufficient finances to be able to provide myself with at least 2 liters of potable water each day. If I ever break that oath, please come to my house and bash my head with a sledgehammer before the Raycons inevitably fail on me too, which means in 2 weeks at most. While on the topic of things that last 2 weeks, as I was saying, there is one feeling I get when going through the beginning of something like Red Dead Redemption or God of War 2018, and it's the feeling that the game is going to be a long experience if the intro itself is this much of a slow burn. Not only is that intimidating because I'm not a kid anymore with all the free time in the world and no responsibilities, but also because the longer the game keeps going, the more cracks it starts to show in its design. It's not easy to make a game with few flaws in the first place, and it's certainly much harder to do so when you're working with hundreds of professionals and pushing the limits on every front, from voice acting, 3D modeling and writing to programming, motion capture and audio engineering. Hell, thanks to the internet we now have Twitch chat integration and butt plug support to worry about too. And add to this the fact that you have to make sure all of it stays together as best as it can for hundreds of hours of playtime in some cases, and it's not hard to see why there can be so many moments where the game drags, becomes tedious or frustrating, or starts to have awkward pacing, performance issues, glitches, crashes, you name it. Which is why sometimes a 4 to 6 hour game that's infinitely simpler and less ambitious made by just a few people can surpass that experience just because it knows what it wants to do and how to do it well without showing a single crack. The short playtime doesn't become a detriment but an advantage to it because it allows for a much tighter experience overall than it would provide otherwise. And that's what I was building up towards with that long tangent, because there is no single word that could describe Endoparasitic better than tight. And no other game is a better example on how to be better than the Callisto Protocol in every way possible despite having 0.1% of its production value. The very first thing you witness upon beginning this game is a guy screaming in pain as 3 of his limbs are brutally ripped off by 3 of the least hairy Kurdish men alive, and the first thing you do after that is drag yourself across the room with your only limb left to cauterize your wounds and escape. But while trying to cross the Armenian border, you find that you are not allowed passage due to carrying a small Turkish man inside you that will change your historical views on certain subjects if he ever reaches your brain, which means that you will have to be put down. As a way to cope with this unique condition, our protagonist jabs his Turkish inhabitant with a syringe of kiwi flavored drink powder to calm his nerves. This is a shocking intro to say the least that happens in like 40 seconds with no explanation about why it all happened weapon. And yet in this short of a time frame, not only does it absolutely succeed in hooking the player to the game and establishing what a fucking badass you are while adding in some mystery as well, but it's only a taste of what's to come. And you better be a badass yourself to be ready for that, because this game does not fuck around with its realistic depictions of the hardships of daily life in Armenia. You can only carry 3 syringes at once and they are not given to you like candy, so you better use them wisely. Not only does the parasite slowly move towards your brain on its own, but the hits of various enemies you encounter throughout the game will also make it jump over a part of the way instantly. Think of it as having a health bar that also slowly decays over time. The parasite part is more important for story and lore purposes. You have to stealth your way around enemies for a couple of rooms at first, but it is thankfully not long before you get your first weapon, and that's when you truly realize what the game has in store for you. See, you get 4 weapons throughout the game, and most of the enemies take very few shots before they go down, while also never coming at you in groups larger than 3 or 4 with the exception of just a couple of rooms. Even the most powerful basic enemy dies in 2 shots from your most powerful weapon, so theoretically none of this should be that difficult, right? Well, here's the problem. That is the problem. See, every action in this game that would normally be trivial to perform has to be done manually, which includes individually unloading and reloading every single bullet to your gun, as well as equipping and unequipping it. Since you're doing all of these with just one hand, which you also use to move, it's also important to note that you have to stop where you are while doing all of these things. Let's say that you have an enemy approaching you and your clip is empty. In almost any other game, you would just have to press the reload button to get a new full clip, shoot the enemy however many times you need to, and then reload again if you want with the same single button. You can also do all of these things while moving quite easily unless you work for Polygon. In this game, however, you have to put enough distance between yourself and the enemy so that you can stop, reach for the correct weapon on your back, pull its clip out, unload your spent bullets if they are still in there by clicking on each of them one by one, reload new bullets by dragging them to the clip slots one by one, shooting the enemy however many times you need to, unloading your spent bullets one by one again and reloading new ones again by dragging each one to the clip and putting your weapon back at the correct place on your body. And there you go, now you can move again with that singular enemy no longer being a threat to you and all your guns reloaded, which means you'll be more ready for the next encounter. Simple, right? Especially considering that if you miscalculate how much distance you put between yourself and the enemy at the beginning to safely do all of these actions, or mess up while trying to perform any of these steps, whether it is reloading by playing the most intense connect the dots game of your life, or successfully landing each hit on the enemy with your gun that recoils like a Genshin player does when he sees a girl above 16, you're gonna have a bad time. And I hope you don't panic when you realize that the only thing you can do when a monster is practically on top of you is to run away, because you physically cannot bend your arm into a shape that allows you to keep shooting it in that situation. So make sure you also don't get your tits in a twist while trying to reach for the correct slot to put your gun away to start moving again, or it's GG. What happens when it's GG? Well, if you're playing on normal, there is sometimes a safe spot here or there during a level, but if you're on hard, you get put back at the start of the level, so have fun. This is probably a good place to transition into the topic of how the game utilizes a lot of elements in its design from the survival horror genre, which is probably a genre you are all familiar with if you're watching a channel like this on YouTube, so I'm not gonna bother delving too deep into this one either, and instead just put a bunch of games that are staples of the genre on the screen for a second so that the small percentage among you that might have went, wait, what is that, can immediately go, oh right, those. But before we get to these juicy design elements, let me address a hypothetical comment you all may have at this point, which is, well Sarp, I don't know how to say this, but I just think you sound very well spoken and smart, and even though we never really spoke before or even saw each other, will you go to prom with me? And also that manually do everything stuff you just talked about sounds kinda tedious if I'm honest. Like it would certainly be a fun challenge the first few times, but if that's how you deal with each enemy, it sounds like it could go all really fast. Well, my dearest, first of all, thank you so much, and I'd love to go out with you if Brad hadn't already asked me out. And he already hired like the most expensive BMW ever for us and bought me this cute red dress which makes my ass look even better than it normally does. And secondly, that would be the case if the game was longer and that's all it had to offer, but that couldn't be further from what's actually the case here. We got 4 different weapons and that many different monsters too, along with a persisting teleporting pursuer monster at the end that leads to a hectic final boss. All of these things are introduced to us at a perfect pace, making it so that just as you are beginning to think you got the hang of the game, a new weapon or monster type that you have to get used to appears out of nowhere and spices things up. You got the basic revolver that carries 6 shots, yet is also the weakest. It is however the most efficient at dealing with the small and fast yet squishy rats. The moment you get the shotgun, your second weapon, is when you realize that you're going to need more inventory slots if you want to be able to carry ammo for all of your weapons. It's not that the ammo isn't scarce, you might find it to be abundant in the earlier levels, but I can assure you that slowly changes the more and more you progress. The reason is that you will start having to deal with more and more enemies that are also tankier with a very strict amount of space to carry your ammo, so you better be on the lookout for those inventory upgrades. They can be quite easy to miss or require you to spend some syringes to get through some parasite scanners. You'll find however that it will be worth the hassle when you pick up the flare gun, which is basically the game's BFG. There are a lot of satisfying plays to be made in this game, but the simplest of those are being able to shoot a rat before the fucker gets to nibble you at least once, and firing one of these bad boys across a long corridor filled with multiple enemies. In fact, it's arguably the most orgasmic sensation ever when these two things combine. I'm looking at you, Mr. Second to last level. There are thankfully a lot of these linear corridors in the game, likely to have the level design complement the game's overall structure, which may probably be the biggest difference between it and the more popular go-to survival horror games of the common video essayist on YouTube. It's honestly surprising that this award doesn't go to the fact that the game is top-down and plays in such an unconventional way, or the fact that it literally looks like a flash game you could play on a browser. But anyway, what I'm getting at is that the game is quite linear, folks, so don't say I didn't warn you. There is no giant mansion, town or police station here where 70% of the game takes place in a non-linear fashion, and I know that may turn some people off since that is one of the most beloved elements of games like Resident Evil and such. But before feeling disappointed by this, let me assure you that this took pretty much nothing from the experience for me, and at no point did I wish that I was in a giant interconnected map, because even though the game is basically many short levels that you play one after the other, there is quite the room for player expression and freedom in most of these levels individually, and the choices you make in one affect the choices you will end up having in the next one. This is because a lot of it depends on how much of which ammo type you have at the beginning of a level, which is directly carried over from how you finish the last one. The game is also saved at the beginnings of levels, and the new save is automatically created each time rather than overriding the last one. That means that if you want to restart the current level with more ammo, you can go back to one of the previous levels and try saving more ammo this time. I have done this a couple of times where I felt like I needed it, but based on my experience, even in the toughest of situations where you start a level with no ammo and little health, it seemed to me that what the level itself had in it in terms of ammo and syringes could always be enough if you just get good enough. And this process of getting good does not only rely on your ability to move, shoot, reload and do every action like that as precisely and efficient as possible, but also on being able to memorize the level layout from your previous attempts and strategizing based upon that. Struggling with killing each enemy, you can try luring them somewhere and imprisoning them, or losing their aggro, although it takes some effort to do the latter. You can try changing up what ammo type you use to deal with which of the enemies in the room, or you can try a different path to the end of the level. All levels are basically an objective of go from point A to point B, except for like a total of 4 straight up combat arenas. There is some linearity to be found on all of them, with a lot of the areas basically being mandatory to traverse through, and some levels are much more linear than others. But in some cases you can also find a few different short alternative paths you can take somewhere, which can be useful for experimenting with approaching an enemy from a different angle, luring it somewhere, or getting around it without having to spend ammo. But just as you begin to feel comfortable darting all over the map of a level to lure enemies here and there and make the slickest escapes, the game slows you down and bends you over, cause it's time to get raped as punishment for that one time you laughed at a meme making fun of blind people. This punishment is dished out by 2 types of enemies that appear in the later half of the game: the corpse traps and the mutated monkeys. The mutated monkeys can see but hear loud noises such as literally any gunfire and run at you at Mach 5 with the intention of immediately and literally clapping your cheeks hard and fast enough to send you back in time to the beginning of the level. Quantum physics are wacky as fuck, but worse are the corpse traps. These enemies are stationary and blind, but are extra sensitive to sound to the point where you have to move slowly around them on top of not firing any of your guns, except one, but we'll come back to that later. And if you do make noise, they will reach out and grope you so aggressively without your consent that it causes physical damage. It's quite a lot of damage too, but they're pretty easy to deal with by themselves, since you literally just have to move slowly past them and you're fine. When they become a problem is when you have to deal with regular enemies that see you while these corpse traps are around. You cannot shoot your guns around them because you will immediately be fingered to death and die as the first ever victim of reverse necrophilia, and if you want to escape from the enemy that's chasing you, you have to do it slowly, because if you don't, the same thing will happen. I cannot stress how unnerving the game becomes once these enemies are introduced. Honestly, I was not feeling the horror part of the game at all up to that point. Even though they are simple to deal with, I can easily tell you that the most nervous I ever got in this game was when I had to slowly move across a room riddled with these things with my health about to deplete and no syringes in my inventory. Their reach is also so sudden and they make no noise, which I honestly find much creepier than if they made some horrible growl or something. The mutated monkeys, for instance, breathe so heavily and loudly, and I know that this is supposed to keep the player nervous, especially when coupled with their frantic movements, but it was still not as nerve-wracking as crawling around corpse traps for me. Don't get me wrong though, those creature sounds and the overall ambience of the game is also really well made, but all of these aspects put into the game in order to up the horror factor will of course still not prevent you from sending these bastards back to where they came from like the one-armed crawling badass you are. This is a survival horror game after all, and although we like to conserve ammo as much as we can, at the end of the day that ammo is for using at some point. And let me tell you that when the game finally put me inside a large chamber and made it mandatory to kill the mutated monkey inside it to proceed, it was clear that moment was meant to inject pure panic directly into my fucking aorta and make me more stressed than my polybridge builds. However, what that monkey didn't see coming was the fact that I had saved up a total of 3 flare gun rounds, 1 inside the gun itself and 2 in my inventory. And if you remember what I said earlier about the flare gun basically being the BFG of the game, you can imagine that it was the poor mutated monkey that was stuck in that room with me and not the other way around. As you may remember, I said before that the game never feels unfair even if you have saved no ammo for a level, and indeed, there were a lot of crossbow bolts spread across that room I could use against the monkey if I had to as well, but it would be so much harder and those flare gun rounds would still keep occupying my inventory. So again, the decisions I had made in the earlier levels along with my skill and efficiency in completing them without spending my most valuable resources made it so that I had more choices once I entered the mandatory mutated monkey fight. And finally letting go of those 2 giant flare rounds in my inventory later let me pick up several rounds for my lighter weapons to use for the weaker but numerous enemies I kept dealing with after that mutated monkey room. This is a perfect example of why the game just works so well and is so damn satisfying to play. You technically never have to begin a level with any ammo and can just get good with enough tries and strategies, but it will always be a little easier if you can keep some ammo with you for the next level, and sometimes even a breeze when it's supposed to be hard as balls if you have played really well for a few levels back to back. But we still have a couple more things to talk about before giving the game its final badge, and I have actually just briefly mentioned one of these things. It's your final weapon, the crossbow. See, this weapon is not only broken but also your bread and butter for the final act of the game. First of all, it is silent, which is why it's introduced soon after the sound sensitive enemies are. You can very easily kill things with it around corpse traps, and it is as powerful as the shotgun, being able to kill the more basic enemies all with one shot. What's even more stupid is that its bolts also do not take up any space in your inventory. You instead have a separate quiver with a maximum number of bolts you can carry, and you can also always, and I mean always, recover your bolts. They never break even on hard regardless of whether you hit or miss. Honestly, if this was in a less challenging game, I could have even said that it needs a nerf. But Sarp, surely there has to be some downside or weakness of this weapon if it's so strong, right? Yes, dear hypothetical viewer that I just made up, there is one weakness of this weapon, and it honestly balances everything out pretty well when you have to use it around sound sensitive enemies. You have to wind up this crank before you can load a bolt in it, which takes a while, and due to that, this weapon easily reloads the slowest because of this extra step. And you can naturally also have one bolt loaded at a time, so when you're dealing with enemies around the corpse trap or mutated monkey and don't have the luxury to use any loud weapons, you better make sure that you don't miss those crossbow shots because the rats sure as hell won't miss you. In any other situation though, the weapon is still busted despite its long reload. The fact that your bolts deal very good damage and can always be retrieved after being shot makes conserving your ammo ridiculously easy compared to the earlier levels where you didn't have this weapon. But this doesn't take away from the game as it's introduced very late, and this last part is more focused on a recurring boss enemy, the teleporting hunter. This enemy keeps pursuing you throughout the last few levels until you reach the final boss, and until then it cannot be killed. It can only be staggered, and doing this will make it stop pursuing you for a while. See, when it's pursuing you, it regularly appears out of nowhere, lunges forward with its blade arm thing, and then disappears shortly after. When it appears and is about to launch, you have to move out of the way and then quickly shoot it with something before it disappears again. Then throughout the short time window before it reappears, you have to reload your weapon and get ready to move. Rinse and repeat until it is staggered. Once it's staggered, it stops pursuing you altogether for a while, and when it appears again, you repeat the same song and dance. You don't really have to stagger it technically, but it also becomes harder to play it through a whole level while it's constantly on your ass. So I prefer dealing with it, even though it honestly is one thing in this game that becomes tedious after a while. But this whole explanation was to say that if you do want to deal with the hunter, the crossbow works wonders since it's an enemy that cannot be killed and rather only driven back when it appears. Ideally, you wouldn't want to spend anything consumable on it since it will not remove any threat permanently but temporarily. So without introducing this broken crossbow with its recyclable bolts, it honestly could have felt a bit punishing rather than rewarding to stagger this thing, because you are not getting any permanent benefits, yet you are permanently losing ammo just to drive it back for 30 seconds before its ass reappears again. And you wouldn't want that in my opinion as the developer, since if the player is engaging with the whole dodge, shoot and reload song and dance until they can stagger the damn thing, they should feel rewarded because that is a challenging thing to do. Yes, it could have introduced more decision making if you didn't have the broken weapon that is objectively the best way to deal with the thing, but it's not like you're forbidden from making that decision in the first place. You can still use the shotgun against it if you want to. It's much more efficient than the crossbow since it has the same damage but can fire 2 shots back to back without reloading, and said reloading is much faster. But do you really want to spend your shotgun rounds that can't be retrieved? The choice is yours, and honestly I personally made that choice sometimes when I was really fed up with the hunter's bullshit and just blasted its ass with the good old boomstick just to get a 30-second breather from all the shenanigans. But enough with that, let's finally get to when we do beat its ass permanently. In other words, the final boss. And as any great final boss should be, it's an amazing final challenge that puts all that you have mastered throughout the game to the test. You have to shoot these 4 giant blobs at the corners of the room that the hunter is drawing its power from, and as you keep chipping away at their combined health bar, they put up these walls of hairy blobs across the room to protect themselves. It's pretty simple to get through these walls since each blob can just be popped instantly by being shot once by any weapon, but the catch is that anything can emerge from these blobs. You can be rewarded with more ammo and health, or you may have to deal with more enemies. While I normally hate bosses that just sit there doing nothing but summon smaller enemies to fight for them, this is one of the first bosses like this I've seen that was actually designed quite well, since the walls allow it to not only emphasize the importance of being efficient with your actions and ammunition like any other situation in the game, but also your positioning, for 2 reasons especially. 1. As more walls are summoned, if any section of the new wall intersects with that of an old wall, the previous wall's blobs there will burst open. This means that the more sections intersect, the more enemies may potentially be released, putting you in a very difficult situation. Since the boss tries to summon these blobs on top of you, you can stay away from any nearby wall blobs that still exist in order to minimize the risk. 2. The hunter can actually damage other enemies with its dash attack, and additionally, if it destroys any of the blobs this way, it will also immediately kill whatever enemy was inside that blob. This means that the optimal way to play the fight is to bait the hunter into getting through these wall blobs by positioning yourself at the correct place beside them and saving your ammo for the big boss blobs. While it sounds simple on paper, there are still so many things that can go wrong in this fight, both due to chance and due to even the smallest error on your part, and these things keep stacking up as the boss gets closer and closer to being killed, making the whole experience so hectic and adrenaline inducing. When I finally beat this boss, I was trying so hard to keep myself alive by constantly jamming syringes to myself as rats were running all around, taking bites out of me as many slower enemies were also approaching. I approached the final blob just in time and took it out with the last of my shotgun rounds while I was just a couple of rat nibbles away from from death. It was such a fucking high, a downright amazing way to wrap up such an excellent game. Before we move on to the final thoughts, there is still one last thing we haven't talked about yet that I need to go over, and that's of course the story. However, I'm not going to tell anything about it this time around. There is very little that is told during the game, and they all come in the form of some files to be read and a few short dialogues, all of which are very lean with little to no filler or small talk, focused on aiming to provide clues to the questions of what is this parasite, why is everyone turning into these mutated things, and who caused all of this. And since the answers to these questions are the main thing we are trying to figure out during the game, pretty much anything I could tell you beyond this would probably be at least a minor spoiler. I normally do get into spoilers after I give a quick warning if I really want to praise or criticize a specific part of the narrative. Here though, I don't really have any particularly strong feelings about any part of it. It gets the job done and is cool to follow through, but also relatively unremarkable compared to every other aspect of the game in my opinion. There isn't anything that is particularly bad, but neither is there anything that stands out or anything we haven't seen before. So I'm just going to call it a decent one that works well with the setting and atmosphere of the game and move on to the final verdict. Overall, Endoparasitic is a very short yet amazing and tight experience with great level design and atmosphere, and a unique take on gameplay mechanics that makes it stand out. It feels great to play and strikes the perfect balance between empowering and challenging the player. In any game with conventional movement and combat, the player would be challenged and empowered by overcoming crazy strong enemies and bosses or brutal platforming challenges. And any game with unconventional movement controls is usually a rage game where the main character or thing that I'm playing as doesn't seem like a badass that overcomes every obstacle in their path with sheer determination, but rather a pretentious stupid asshole that has to climb a mountain with a fucking hammer while sitting in a cauldron instead of doing it like a normal person in order to feel unique and to spite me with their existence. I never actually played Getting Over It by the way, but I'm guessing that's how most people feel about it. All I'm trying to say is that I appreciate this game's approach where you actually fight a pretty underwhelming entourage of enemies if you think about it. For a Resident Evil or Dead Space protagonist, this entire game could pretty much only pass as a tutorial level with slow zombies, little rats, a handful of corpses and gorillas, and 4 giant blobs as the final boss. But for a guy with just one limb and a parasite slowly eating his insides, it is really fucking badass to be able to get through this much shit. And it feels badass for the player too, since the gameplay mechanics reflect how mountainous of a task it would be to do anything at all in that situation. It's not just the mechanics in fact, but the controls as well. I mentioned this very briefly at the beginning of the video, but you, the player, also use only one arm to play the game. Everything is mapped to your mouse. You shoot and drag yourself or things in the menu with the left click, interact with things or pick them up with the right click, and open and close your inventory with the mouse wheel. It feels very weird at first why there are no hotkeys for some of these things and so many things are mapped to the same input sometimes, but it complements the whole design and mechanics of the game so well, and it's not actually that hard to get used to. I don't know, a small detail, but I just think that it's so neat that you also do everything with just one hand like the protagonist himself. I want to say lastly that I'm glad this game seems to be getting the recognition it deserves. It didn't seem that popular around the time when I bought it after seeing it on a pretty generous sale a couple months ago, but I've lately been seeing numerous popular YouTubers and streamers play it, and I thought that I might as well do my part too, as small as it is. With games like this and Signalis rising in popularity among recent survival horror titles, I'm very excited for the future of this genre, since it feels like people have been dwelling so much on the olden days for so long in the absence of any good new games. God knows that we don't need the 50 millionth Silent Hill 2 retrospective going on about how much of a masterpiece it is, so if you're also looking to move on to something new, I highly recommend this game. If you like survival horror at all, just looking for a really tight, challenging game that you can finish in a few hours, or feel intrigued by anything I've said in this video about the game, then give it a shot. It is definitely worth its price tag in my opinion. With all of that being said, thank you all so much for watching. This video will likely be out a couple of weeks after New Year's, so I wish that 2023 will be a great year for all of you out there. I know that the world is in a lot of turmoil right now and things may feel bleaker and more uncertain each year as time goes on, but I still try to do my best in not letting it get to me and discourage me from the things I'm passionate about, and I hope that you are able to keep the same mindset despite everything as well. And that mindset is why you can be sure that this trend of longer videos will keep continuing this year as well. I've tried my best to make make a hard turn for my channel near the end of 2022 from the short meme clips to these longer videos where I can inject more of my personality rather than just combine a couple of internet jokes, because these are the ones I love making the most and feel the proudest of. They're still far from perfect and I'm still trying to improve myself in every way I can, so I hope you'll be willing to stick with me through all of this. Anyways, Happy New Year's everyone, and I hope to see you all again in the next video. Take care of yourselves and thanks for watching.